We're there. We're on screen, and we are live. And hi, everyone. This is LinkedIn Live. I'm Julia Poger. I'm a business, conference, and diplomatic interpreter. I work from Russian and French into English, and from English into Russian. And as you probably know, I also run a business called Know Your Worth. Know Your Worth. Here we go. Ta-da! Which helps interpreters and really any service professional to understand how to get your name out there, how to sell your services, how to negotiate your services, so that you can work at the fees and the conditions that you want. So please write into the comments where you're listening in from today, and we can say hi all over the world from what I can tell from the attendance list pre this broadcast. Before we move into our topic today, I would like to ask you to stick around until the end of the show to find out who will be our first guest in the new year. So today's show is on diplomatic interpreting, and I wrote a really nice introduction, so I'm about to read it off to you because it's all diplomatic and protocol-like. And diplomatic interpreting has been getting a lot of press lately. A lot of people have been talking about it all over the place, all over the internet. So I thought it would be a really good idea for us to hear from a real expert, somebody who's spent much of her career in diplomatic interpreting. So my special guest today is Patricia Magno-Holt, formerly known as Patsy Arizu. Patsy has been a conference interpreter and a diplomatic interpreter throughout her career, both as a freelancer and as a staff interpreter. And after she started working as a staff interpreter at the US Department of State Office of Language Services, later on, she became the chief interpreter there. So she was the top diplomatic interpreter for Spanish English. And she oversaw the other staff interpreters who worked with various other languages and hired countless freelancers, including yours truly, to cover almost any language under the sun for jobs ranging from citizen diplomacy to top-level diplomacy. So if anybody knows anything about diplomatic interpreting, it's Patsy. Welcome, Patsy.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
So before we get started, let me just show you. We have people calling in from Bavaria and from Brazil and from Italy. Oh gosh, 2 people from Italy. In fact, you might know a couple of them. Mm-hmm. And from Dubai and yes, and Geneva. And I'm trying to get, here we go. I think you might remember some of these people, Jean-Marie and Diana. And so we've got lots of people coming in. So what I'd like to say is, nice to see you too, Diana. What I'd like to say is we have a lot of questions that came in before we started today. And Patsy has been gracious enough to say that if you have a lot of questions coming in throughout the show, we'll try and get to all of them. So we may last a little longer than 30 minutes today, but hopefully not by much. So Patsy, I'd really like to ask you the very first question, because everybody really kind of needs to know this. And that is, what exactly is diplomatic interpreting?
Good question. Let's first start with a definition of diplomacy, because we'll take it from there. And according to the Encyclopedia Britannica, which I think is a good source, diplomacy is the established method of influencing the decisions and behavior of foreign governments and peoples through dialogue, through negotiation, and through other measures short of war or violence. Now, diplomacy is often confused with foreign policy, not the same thing. These terms are not synonymous. Diplomacy is the chief, but not the only instrument of foreign policy, which is set by political leaders through diplomats, in addition to, say, military and intelligence officers. who may advise those who set foreign policy. Foreign policy is the one that establishes the goals, establishes strategies, and sets the tactics that are going to be used in their accomplishment. So a diplomatic interpreter is the language resource that aids diplomats or political leaders, political figures, government figures in the attainment of their goals through the various meetings that they have with people from other governments.
Okay, so basically, it's only working between two governments then at whatever level. I mean, even if it's citizen diplomacy, it's between two countries in particular. You wouldn't think that unless they were bilats, for example, bilateral meetings at the UN, would you consider the UN General Assembly to be diplomatic interpreting? Just off the top of my head.
I would say that many of the components at multilateral fora, like the United Nations, are going to be some form of diplomatic interpreting.
Okay.
Excuse me. Not so much necessarily in the formal meetings that take place, always, but definitely in the interactions, as you know, at these fora, and you know this, Julia, better than anyone. You've got a lot of experience with it. Much of the real work is not done in the big meeting itself, but rather in the hallways where these various diplomats can meet and talk and work things out. But you bring up an interesting point, because it's not just between two governments. Diplomatic interpreting can take place in a variety of settings with a number of principles. You can have two governments, you can have 3, 4, dozens of governments. You know, case in point, the G7 meetings or the G20 meetings. There are all kinds of things like that. So yes, diplomatic interpreting is going to take place in a lot of places. And we'll talk later about the various physical places it can take place in and the various modes of interpreting, which is another one of the questions, I think.
Yes, yes. Okay, well, that was a really good kind of introduction just to set the scene. So to get into those modes and so on, how do diplomatic interpreters work then? What is it they do? What are the basics for their job?
The basic modes of interpreting for diplomatic interpreting are going to be the tried and tested and true earliest form of interpreting ever, which is consecutive. And many of you listening to us know all about consecutive. Julia is one of the great practitioners of the art, and she's one of the great teachers today of the art as well. It truly is an art. So consecutive interpreting was actually the kind of interpreting used for centuries before the second mode came in, which is simultaneous interpreting. Simultaneous interpreting, which originally was called telephonic interpreting because they didn't have the equipment we have today. They were actually using telephones.
Oh, gosh.
And this started, you can go into the history of it, when it was first used somewhere, I think in San Francisco, at a meeting predating the League of Nations, predating the United Nations. And of course, as you know, telephonic interpreting was used at the Nuremberg trials, and we know all about the history of that. And there is, and I would also say, as an aside, true interpreters were very leery of simultaneous interpreting. They thought that it was not to be done, and it was not acceptable, and it was just a fad, and it was going to disappear. Well, it didn't, as we well know. And then we have the third mode, which is whispering or chuchotage. And the whispered interpreting, of course, is the one that you will use many times in a meeting so that you don't take up all the time that you require when you use full-blown consecutive, say with just 2 people in the room with their interpreters. The interpreters will be whispering to the principals and basically providing a running sort of simultaneous without equipment.
I remember once being in a meeting where everybody spoke the foreign language, basically, except for one person. And so when they got up to make their toast in the foreign language, I realized that, and instead of holding up the whole consec thing, I ran over to do the whispering, and everybody was like, "What's going on? What's going on?" But they did appreciate the fact it took less time. Yes.
Yeah, yeah, it does. It does. So for a diplomatic interpreter, here's the golden rule, something that most people are not aware of, and many diplomatic interpreters themselves, hired by governments, are not aware of.
Mm-hmm.
In diplomatic interpreting, the interpreter is the voice of his or her principal.
Mm-hmm.
So if President Biden were speaking at a gathering with another government or with other governments, his interpreter would interpret President Biden's words into the foreign language or languages for the rest of the gathering. And the same.
So the U.S. interpreter would interpret into the other languages.
Right.
Okay.
Now, this is going to create problems sometimes because in some cases you have countries that have a professional cadre of conference interpreters who work at the diplomatic level for them, and many of them are a language speakers of those foreign languages.
Mm-hmm.
But many times we find that a government, maybe a foreign ministry, doesn't have its own interpreting office. Very few of them do, let's be honest. There are many governments that actually just hire freelance interpreters to do the work. And so you find yourself in a situation where there are interpreters who find that they go into a meeting, oh my goodness, I have to be the voice, but my language is a B or sometimes even a C, and they're much more comfortable working into their A language. But the fact is, you can't interpret correctly at that level for your principal if you are not well versed in what the principal's objectives are, what the foreign policy of your country is, and what the points for that meeting are. In other words, what is your principal trying to achieve in that meeting?
Mm-hmm. Just for those people who may not be part of IEC or might not be this kind of an interpreter, an A language would be a native language. A B language would be a foreign language into which somebody would interpret. So I would interpret into Russian, for example, but it's not my native language. And a C language is French, which I've got to say I would never, ever interpret into, but I do understand well enough to interpret out of it into my native language, which is my A language, English. So just as a quick explanation of that. But yes, that I do remember the first time I was hired by State Department to work at a summit level. I worked for Mrs. Gore and for Mrs. Clinton, and realizing that I was going to have to really up my game into Russian to make sure that that Russian was saying exactly what the women were saying. That was, the first time I realized it was scary. After having done it, then you realize, it's no different from any other interpreting from the language point of view, but from the behavior point of view, it was extremely different. So is there anything that you can tell us a bit about, say, the behavior and how we work? Is there anything you want to touch on that, or should we talk about that a little bit later?
I think we can touch on that a little bit later, but just to round out this this particular topic, and of course, I'm sure if there are any questions about this, I'm sure our listeners are going to provide them to you so that we can clarify anything that you need more information on. But where does diplomatic interpreting take place? We talked, for example, about meetings, one-on-one meetings, they're called, where you have one principal from either side. The interpreter in every meeting where you have actual personal contact, not in a big meeting room with booths where simultaneous is being used, but if consecutive is being used, or even, small equipment simultaneous, to, for want of a better term. The interpreter is always referred to as a +1. In other words, the interpreter is not considered a member of the delegation. That the interpreter is not counted as a person, because as you can imagine, when these meetings are set up, they go through a very protracted and important negotiation to decide how many people will be present at the meeting, who is allowed to be there, who will be the note taker, and the interpreter is a +1 for either side. Now, the meetings can take place with a 1-on-1. They can be a 2-on-2. They can be a 5-on-5, full cabinet on one side, full cabinet on the other side. Or you can have, for example, several delegates from different countries getting together, and each one of them will have their interpreter or interpreters, depending on how many languages are involved. You can have a press conference. Press conferences are probably one of the most stressful kinds of diplomatic interpreting for anyone, either in consecutive or in simultaneous. An interpreter may be working on the telephone for a telephone conversation, where the interpreter is listening, and everything is done in full-blown consecutive, obviously. We used to do phone calls. They still do them in what's known as the Situation Room of the White House. All the telephone calls go through that. With the Department of State, it's called the Operations Center or Ops Center. You can do it through a video conference. As we know, thanks to the dastardly pandemic, we now have all kinds of new digital arrangements where we can see each other, as we are doing today. You can have an open air speech. I have been called upon to do full-blown consecutive in front of a crowd of 20, 25,000 people. Well, that can be pretty stressful as well, where you have a speech that your principal is going to be reading out, or sometimes there is no speech at all, and you're just you're relying on your notes. So consecutive interpreting is really, really, I cannot stress this enough, really important if you want to be a diplomatic interpreter. And of course, that brings into play all the physical and temporal challenges that you can imagine. I have done phone calls on the spur of the moment.
Just so you see this, where Natalia
Yes,
says she's heard you in several press conferences and used them in her interpreting classes.
Oh, good. I hope I didn't make too many mistakes. I've ended up doing telephone calls sitting on the curb of a sidewalk, because a telephone call comes in all of a sudden. It's kind of like, when the baby decides to be born, it just happens. And I couldn't make it into the White House in time. And so I just did the phone call from where I was. It just so happened I was walking on the street towards the White House. And there we were. And the other very important reason why the diplomatic interpreter is the voice of his or her principal is the fact that a good diplomatic interpreter has an amazing institutional memory. And sometimes
this is just for you to let you know you were great.
Thank you so much, Natalia. And sometimes the interpreter at a meeting has much more time spent with the other side and on this particular subject than, say, a brand new president or prime minister. And that's a really important component that the diplomatic interpreter brings to any meeting.
Okay. There is one quick question on this particular issue, which is, Kate asks, is there ever a situation in which one interpreter alone has to serve both parties, in which case they're working back and forth and they are the only interpreter?
Hello, Kate. It's good to know you're here. Absolutely. There are cases as I said before, where the interpreter from the other side is a B or even a C language speaker, and the other side decides for some reason that they would rather work with just the one interpreter, or the interpreter in my case provided by the United States, the staff interpreter from the US. I've been called upon on more than one occasion to interpret for both sides. It was not a decision I made or I accepted. This was a decision made by the powers that be on both sides. And then I was asked by the US government to provide interpreting for the other government. For example, I have provided a full-blown consecutive interpreter for an address to the joint houses of Congress in Washington, D.C. I have done press conferences for a foreign president. I have also provided interpreting for both sides in the Oval Office. So there was only the one interpreter, and not only me, but there are other members of staff who have done that in the past. And it's, you know, it's a great, it's a high form of praise when someone asks you to do that. But as I said, these are very formal diplomatic situations where these things are negotiated and decided upon by the governments, not by the interpreters. Ever.
So nobody could ever come up to you during the meeting and say, could you just do both sides? I mean, unless there was some kind of an obvious emergency where the other interpreter suddenly is giving birth or whatever, God forbid, you know, knock on wood, you would always have to go through those diplomatic channels, the protocol and so on and so forth, right? You don't make that decision for yourself.
I would never make that decision on my own. I don't believe any diplomatic interpreter should. That would have to be run by your government officials and accepted by them.
Okay. We have a couple of comments here. One by Miguel Almonte, who says, institutional memory reminds me of a scene in A Perfect Murder where the interpreter told her principal that the Russian diplomat was reciting the same speech given weeks before. I may have to watch that film now.
Yeah.
And we have a question also. Are interpreters in diplomatic interpreting ever asked to interpret between two strong B languages, say if it were a rare language pair in that country, like Japanese, Spanish, for example?
Absolutely. And there are, I can tell you, there are a number of true B interpreters who are phenomenal at their craft. And yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Well, I think this might lead us to the next question, which is actually, what are the main do's and don'ts of diplomatic interpreting etiquette, since we're now discussing almost the nuts and bolts of it?
Well, we've already discussed one aspect of the etiquette. Actually, several aspects of the etiquette, not just one. Julia's business is called Know Your Worth. And I would say that for the diplomatic interpreter, the motto should be know your place. That's a very important thing to keep in mind. Main do's and don'ts. Know who you are in the room. You are, in many ways, a fly on the wall. And you are the ghost in the room, in many ways, who bridges the cultural divide between the parties and allows for the free flow of conversation, discussion, exchange of ideas. The best interpreter is the one who is not even noticed because the conversation flows so freely. But the best interpreter is also one who will be remembered long after the meeting because they did so well. But at the same time, you know, I always say that one of the things you remember as an interpreter is you are putting on this phenomenal performance, or at least trying to, but there will be no applause. And there will be no thank yous necessarily. The parties will move on. This is a very serious business. And so if you're in it for yourself, this is the wrong business for you. You are working for a political animal. And the political animal has an objective or a series of objectives that you are trying to help her or him achieve. It's very much like Stanislavski in acting. There's an objective, and you have to figure out what the objective is or what the various layers of objectives are and handle that. You need
And if
to
you're
know what is.
lucky,
Sorry?
and if you're lucky, your side will tell you what those objectives are ahead of time. They'll tell you the talking points and so on.
But, you know, as we all know, because one of the things we all do is we converse. And we know that in conversation, there is what is said, there is what is unsaid. Things move. Conversation, discussion is not a static thing. And so things are changing on the fly, and an interpreter has to have the intelligence and what in Spanish is called la mano izquierda, the left hand, to know how to handle things, you know, all the time. So one of the main don'ts is don't make yourself felt. Don't make yourself a presence in the room. As I had to say, unfortunately, to a contract interpreter once who was not hired again, I'm sorry, you're not a guest at the meeting. You'd like to be. I would like to be, but we're not. And
I found that a tiny bit confusing sometimes when working in my language combination, because I knew my place and I kept thinking that the other side didn't know theirs. But then it turns out that in the other country, the interpreters are seen as diplomats in their own right. And so therefore, they are actually part of the diplomatic corps. So they could move from being an interpreter to a consul or even an ambassador. In fact, the ambassador in one organization that I interpret for regularly now used to be an interpreter for the Soviet presidents using French, for example.
Absolutely.
So, you know, they can move, but we don't tend to, do we?
No, that does not happen in the United States. That does not happen in any European country I can think of. But I can tell you it happens regularly in the former Soviet Union and today in the Russian Federation. It also happens in the People's Republic of China. In fact, a former Chinese premier started out his career as an interpreter.
Gosh.
There's
Okay,
homework for you. You can look that one up.
I'm going to ask one more of my own questions, actually, that came in earlier before I get to the three that I see so far on the screen. And this is, recently, there's been a lot of talk about how interpreters are not knowing their place, basically, necessarily. They're not invisible. They're not just the conduit, that they're actually shaping the conversation through their word choice or their tone of voice. And I'm sure that we've all been in situations where we've seen where one interpreter has, say, a more energetic presentation and people in the room sit up a little more, and then somebody else has a bit of a more, shall we say, soporific, sleep-inducing presentation. Everybody kind of relaxes a little more and so on. So already we're shaping a bit. But, and I know, for example, in the latest New Yorker documentary film, their short documentary films that they put out once a month, I think, is about 3 interpreters from the ICTY, the Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. And one of the interpreters there said, I can choose my words and my tone of voice and give a faithful rendition while escalating or calming down the situation. As the chief interpreter and as one of the diplomatic interpreting do's and don'ts, what do you think about that?
The idea of shaping the conversation is a very elastic term, and I think it is something to be handled with kid gloves. The idea of shaping the conversation, shaping the discourse, shaping or affecting the objective or objectives of a principal is not something I would accept in any interpreter or myself. That is not your role. Just like I might say to my principal, I think this cough medicine is very good. It might help you with your cough, but I am not the White House doctor. That's not my role. I don't set foreign policy. I don't set diplomatic objectives. I am there to convey a message in another language couched in another culture. So if I find in the time that I was hiring interpreters, diplomatic interpreters, if I were to find anyone doing something like that, that person would not be used for meetings again. You can mold the presentation. I'm going to give you one example of something that's absolutely benign, but it's not affecting the objective or objectives in any way. For example, I was traveling with President Clinton, and he one of the things we did on that trip was he had an open air speech in front of a crowd of about 30,000 people. Those meetings are fraught, as you can imagine. Those events, I should say. There was a group of 3 or 4 people to one side who were heckling the delegation. And of course, you always have a situation where you've got a male speaker, but you have a female interpreter. There are things a male voice can do that a female voice can do, and vice versa. So I decided in this case, I wasn't going to start raising my voice the way the president was raising his. Instead, I used my female voice and brought it down so that people would have to strain to listen to me a little bit, even though I was mic'd. Yeah. And what happened was the crowd around the group of 3 or 4 hecklers basically shut them down because they wanted to hear the interpretation of what the president had said. So that's one way I would say that's a benign form of molding the conversation. But if you get involved in changing the dynamic, changing anything that has to do with the objective or anything that has to do with the message itself, no, that's not your job.
Okay. Thank you. So we have 5 questions now. I will take them in order that we got them. The first is from Jean-Marie. It's nice to see you again, Jean-Marie. So does one become a diplomatic interpreter thanks to opportunity and experience, or is there formal training for that, such as Julia's CCIC? Well, it's not just my Cambridge Conference interpretation course, but I do organize it. It's true. Thank you for the kind words, Jean-Marie. And Patsy teaches on it, where you can hear a bit more about diplomatic interpreting as well. So Patsy?
I think, Jean-Marie, that's a great question. And yeah, actually, in the past, there was no formal training. Diplomatic interpreters were basically chosen from people who had the background and the education to be able to do this kind of work. But I think more and more you are seeing all kinds of training that is happening for diplomatic interpreting. Unfortunately, we don't see diplomatic interpreting training taking place at the tertiary level for professional interpreter training. And that is why I think both Julia and I feel strongly about the need for such training. So basically, the more we discuss it, and I would say the more we discuss it with people who have been hired as staff diplomatic interpreters, the better off you are. I know there are many people out there who claim to be diplomatic interpreters. Yes, there are many freelance interpreters who've been hired by governments to interpret for heads of state, heads of government, senior political or government figures. That doesn't mean that they have been tested in this kind of work. Staff interpreters at the various government foreign ministries that do hire such interpreters actually test everyone who comes through, and you know for sure that those people do have the skills needed to do this kind of work.
Yeah, I'm very grateful actually for the fact that when I was hired for my very first top level diplomatic job, I happened to live in Washington, and I happened to be in the office a lot at the time. And I got some of the best advice from the other staff interpreters there. My favorite, because I was going to Russia in the winter, was when your motorcade arrives, you will be in the last car. You are always in the last car. Do not rush to get up to the front car because they'll wait for you. You don't want to break your leg getting up to the front of the motorcade. You'll be fine. You'll get there. They'll wait. They'll come out. You'll work. On the other hand, at the end of the meeting, that motorcade is going as soon as they're in the car. You run for your car and you get there as fast as you can, because otherwise you'll be left behind. Oh my God, those were fraught days, I have to admit, but that was the best advice I got.
One of the best pieces of advice I got when I first started working at the Department of State for the White House was, if there are 5 minutes and you see a bathroom, use it. You may not be able to use another one later the same day.
I think you might have given me that when I was there.
Very important.
I think you might have passed that one on to me. It was good. Okay, next from Eva Boder, who would like to know, have you ever had a Czech interpreter present or acted as one? So somebody who checks your interpretation to make sure that you're being faithful.
Well, that's an interesting question when it comes to diplomatic interpreting, because there is an inbuilt Czech interpreter. I hate to use the word Czech because it sounds like CZECH, and that's not the same thing. But in diplomatic interpreting, each side has an interpreter. And the interpreter from the other side is always checking what the other interpreter is saying. And if there's ever any misinterpretation, anything said in the interpretation that could lead to a misunderstanding, the other interpreter will probably point that out. Of course, it would be very bad form to point that out in the middle of the meeting, go, whoa, you said such and such. No, that's not what you do. But you may point it out to your side after the meeting is over. This is what the interpreter said, but what the principal said was this. You might want to take that into account. So that is the only, shall we say, quality control that takes place in the interpretation. And the other thing you have to remember is that many times the principals themselves, or a member of the delegation or members of the delegation, will actually be either fluent or will at least understand the other language. And sometimes the principal himself or herself is absolutely fluent in the other language, but for reasons of protocol must speak in his or her native language. And so that person is checking the interpretation as well, whether you like it or not.
True. We are about 10 minutes beyond our 30-minute mark, but we have 4 questions left. Would that be okay, Patsy? Along with my last question. Okay. Sure. So from Eugenia Pinali. Hello, Eugenia. Are there any situations in which you have to work on your own for long hours, and how do you cope with that?
Absolutely, Eugenia. Nice to see you. Yes, there are. In diplomatic interpreting, when you're traveling with the president, there is nobody else to resort to. Sometimes you take a team of interpreters. Sometimes it's just you. And sometimes the days will be 18 hours long. And sometimes you will really scramble for that bathroom. How do you cope? Always have something to drink, always have something to eat in your bag. Pace yourself. And the other thing too is just work with your delegation so that you are not taxed beyond your abilities. Make sure that you have the manpower or woman power that you need for the entire event or for the entire trip.
Mm-hmm. Just a quick comment from somebody back on the shaping discussion. A dearly departed mentor spoke of a time when he generally sanitized a French-speaking military officer's press conference. In other words, he didn't use the soldiers' profanities, but he told the officer that it was what he should have said during a press conference. So that wasn't the interpreter who just wrote the comment. That was somebody else, and they're no longer with us. So we shall refrain from commenting on that.
Well, the profanity is part of language, and it does come up. And when it has come up, you interpret what was said. And I can assure you that I'm in a room, I'm interpreting, and I say what the person just said, and heads turn. And they will look at you, and you will look at them with a straight face as if to say, I am interpreting.
That reminds me of the first time, and I checked this with my language boss at State Department beforehand, when I was interpreting between President Yeltsin and President Clinton, and President Yeltsin had moved to the informal version of you in Russian with President Clinton and was calling him Bill. And so that was interpreted. I interpreted that, and then because I was between the two of them at the time, and then President Clinton turned to him and said, "Yes, Boris, you're right." And I used Boris and the you. I had to force it. I had to really force it because it felt wrong. And President Yeltsin looked at me like this, and then he realized what happened, and he's like, "Ah, okay, right, okay, no problem." But it did take a second for both of us to accustom ourselves to that whole idea.
Julia, that's a very important question. And I'm reading Jean-Marie's new question about, you'll read that back, Julia.
I'll bring it back up again.
But in a number of languages, you have the like in French, you have the tu and the vous, and in Spanish, you have the tú and you have the usted. And you have to work through the intricacies of that. And in English, you don't have that because we only use you. We don't use thou anymore. So you have to decide when it's appropriate to change the pronoun. And that's part of the interpreter's art. But that also facilitates in conversation, because if you realize that somebody is pushing into that level of familiarity, you have to go with it and leave yourself out of it.
No, it's true. That first time, it is still something of a glass wall to push through especially because when I'm interpreting, I only ever use the formal version, at least up until that point. I had never used anything else. Okay, so back to Jean-Marie's second question on security. What level of security clearance does a diplomatic interpreter need? And are there security concerns, personal security, given the highly sensitive material in this field?
Okay, absolutely. There are many levels of security. I'm only going to speak for the Office of Language Services, Department of State, that serves the White House and the U.S. government, the U.S. federal government. Staff interpreters are U.S. citizens, either born or naturalized. Staff interpreters go through a security clearance, yes, and depending on the level of the kind of work that they're doing, there will be different levels of security clearance. In fact, some levels of security clearance are only temporary for certain meetings. They only last a finite amount of time. I can't speak for what other governments do, but I'm giving you my experience in the United States. And by the way, I can tell you right now, for anyone who has a working visa in the United States or has U.S. citizenship, the Office of Language Services is looking to recruit interpreters in a very broad variety of languages as we speak.
Good to know. And that will get to my last question, but only after the last two from the group. So here we have David Higbee again, who says, what's the biggest challenge for experienced interpreters in other fields, and specifically court interpreters, to becoming skilled in diplomatic interpreting and transitioning to diplomatic interpreting? Are there any advantages to doing this?
Very, very interesting question. Thank you for that. I think we could have a whole session on that topic. I can't answer you in the time that we have left, but I think that you just touched on something that should be addressed, and we could have an hour-long meeting at least on that one topic. I think one of the challenges that court interpreters have is the way in which they are required to interpret. At least I'm talking about the United States here, where they have some very severe limitations put on them in terms of how, what kind of vocabulary they can use, or how much off track they can go to actually get the message across. And that results in a lot of stumbling blocks for court interpreters that I have worked with when they try to make the jump to conference interpreting and to anything other, anything at that level, be it diplomatic or whatever. But I think there are enormous benefits to trying to move from court interpreting to conference interpreting of any sort. First of all, because I think financially you're going to make more money. And I think the nature of the work is going to be incredibly interesting. I can tell you, I worked as a conference interpreter starting at age 19, and I worked on 3 different continents. I worked throughout the UN family of organizations, both in Europe and in the United States. And I got to a point where, very honestly, I was bored. And I didn't find my work all that interesting. When I began working as a diplomatic interpreter and I was hired to become a staff interpreter, all of a sudden, it was like a new lease of life for me as an interpreter. It was just fascinating work. And the work was constantly changing. And the subjects were constantly different. And I had to study day after day after day because I was dealing with so many different things. And they were all very, very interesting. So I would recommend it highly.
Okay, I actually have a couple more things. One quick question from Mohammed. Does the when in Rome phrase apply to diplomatic interpreting? Not quite sure what he has in mind with this, but
I don't quite understand the question. I would say forget the when in Rome thing. Just remember that you are providing a service between Rome and Carthage. And so what you are trying to do is bridge the cultural divide between the two.
That's pretty good. I like that answer. So our next question is actually, I'm going to bring it up, but then I'll ask the one that came in from before as well, which is, what sources and materials would you recommend for aspiring diplomatic interpreters to hone their skills? Asks Anna.
I'll give you a very simple answer to that, Anna, in the time we have remaining. Read, read, read. Read good dailies in your language. Read good periodicals all the time. Find out how things are being discussed in the language you're going to be working into that is not necessarily your native language. You can be stumped by the stupidest things. I'll never forget the first time I had to say the word Smurf in Spanish. My children were grown up. I wasn't exposed to Smurfs in Spanish. So little things like that, just knowing, what the day-to-day language is. I said to people during the pandemic, read about the pandemic in all your other languages so you know how all these different terms are being said. Because unless you're living the language in the country, you're going to have a problem. So reading constantly is the best piece of advice I can give you. And know what's going on in the world.
Okay, well, this leads very nicely into my last question, which is, what exactly is it that chief interpreters are looking for from the interpreters that they are hiring as freelancers to be diplomatic interpreters? Longer in words than actually on the screen, but there you go.
What is a chief interpreter looking for? You're looking for someone who has obviously the language skills, and not just the language skills, but somebody who has an educated level of language, a level of language that allows them to move in any register. You are looking for someone with intelligence, very important. You're looking for someone who keeps up to date on what's going on and really knows what's going on. Okay, so are you aware of current events in as much of the world as you possibly can? Do you know who these names are? You're also looking for someone who is a good team player, because interpreters may be working on their own very much as diplomatic interpreters, but they're still part of a team, either a language team or a delegation team or a government team. And you're looking for people who can go with the flow, because circumstances are changing constantly. You never know what's going to hit you. You never know what the next day will bring. Schedule will change all of a sudden. So people who can adapt readily and, move quickly and get things done and figure out solutions to problems are very important as well.
Okay, and just as our last comment then, we've been getting quite a few comments in the list, but this one seems to sum it up very nicely. And it's nice to see Mariana here as well. Such an interesting session, thank you. So I think at 4:52 our time, we probably have come to the end of the questions. So before we get to today's top tip, I just wanted to let you know that the next show will be on January 7th. Again, at the same time, 4 p.m. CET. We will attempt to hold it to 30 minutes, I promise. And we'll have another special guest to talk about the interpreter's voice. This guest will be both a conference interpreter and a RADA-trained actress, so the Royal Academy of Dramatic Arts in London, and has experience in both worlds, both as an interpreter and an actress. And her name is, let me just pull up that screen, share screen, and it's a little difficult on this particular thing. And her name is, ta-da, Patsy Magno-Holt. We'll be having Patricia Magno-Holt again in January, but this time we'll be speaking specifically about the interpreter's voice and this incredible tool that we have that we need to take care of, or else it will just leave us and we will no longer be able to be interpreters, which would be very, very unfortunate, I have to say. So that will be our next session. So thank you, Patsy, for agreeing to come on twice in a row. And in fact, we thought it would be a good gift for all of you to start the year off right. And it'll be very practical, and there'll be some exercises we can all do together. And I promise to be the model who does the funny things with their face on the screen, so that you can always look brilliant, Patsy, and I'll just do the funny stuff. So today's top tip, actually, I think there might be two, though one of them, because Patsy said one of them was fantastic, but it's not necessarily something you can do today. The non-today top tip, I think, would be know your place. I think that that's fantastic, because it really helps you understand that you aren't the guest at the meeting, you aren't the host at the meeting, you are the voice of your principal. and your voice is only serving what your principal is saying to serve his goals or her goals. So I like that as a top tip. But as a very practical top tip for the end of the show, as Patsy said earlier, keep up with current events in all of the countries that speak any of your languages. You need to be reading periodicals all the time, reading articles, being on the internet. You know, I'm a fan of Twitter lists. Make Twitter lists in your various languages and so on, and keep up with everything that people are talking about. Do you know how to say all of the different rounds of the World Cup in all of your languages? Because, hey, it's on right now. So this is our top tip for today. And that's it. Let's just see what we have. I see we've got a whole bunch of comments coming up at the moment. And they all seem to be saying thank you. So Patsy, you have been a fantastic guest, I have to say. And it's a pleasure listening to you. And the whole thing has been very fascinating. So thank you so much for coming today. Remember, if you want to rewatch this, if you're on LinkedIn, there will be a notification that it's still, that this event is over. And so you can go and rewatch it. I will be uploading this to the Know Your Worth by Julia Poger YouTube channel, and I'll post underneath the event the link to the YouTube channel so that you can watch this one, rewatch this one, or watch any of the past or future ones, since that's the playlist thing. So thank you so much for all of your questions and for being here today and all of your support. And thank you, Patsy, for making this be a fantastic show. And see you in January. Happy holidays. Happy holidays to everybody. So.